my job and pleasure to introduce Phil Metris. I didn't want to go through the awards and bio, although he has many awards, and I mean, his work is amazing. I just wanted to tell you a story about how I went over to Belfast in Northern Ireland this past summer, and I met with several peace activists and government officials and poets and writers, and Phil's name kept coming up again and again. And I wasn't familiar with his work, but people told me, you've got to read him, you've got to read him. So I went around to the bookshop. I was at Queen's University in Belfast. And I picked up Sand Opera at the bookstore. And I read it on the flight home, and I was just amazed. I mean, it's an incredible work of art in many ways. And I do hope that you'll buy a copy if you haven't already done so. And see how beautiful the book is put together. Each of the poems is special unto itself, but the visual is amazing. So it's written as Phil brings his talents as a musician, as a poet, as an artist to this collection, and I was just so amazed at the artistry, and I'm so happy that he agreed to come. Yeah, I'm so glad that he agreed to come to read here in Southern Maryland tonight. So why should we listen to Phil Metris and his work in Sand Opera and his other work? Because perspective matters. You need to include all points of view to get the whole picture. And Sand Opera tells the story of post-9/11 wars from excluded points of view. From Iraqis, a drone operator wondering what he's hitting, a soldier's wife, the abused of Abu Ghraib, an Arab-American child. These are voices that embody our common humanity and the dehumanization of war. Because if all we get is a partial picture from the news channels and the popular media, we make decisions and we develop feelings and attitudes for other people based on half-truths at best. We should listen to Phil Metris because love matters too. And I mentioned earlier that his work is important because it reminds us that we live at a time when we need to make a decision. Either we're going to love or we're going to hate. And the work that he's done with this book and other projects, it makes us feel that there is something worth loving in the world. And that means other people. And the use of poetry, of writing, of literature, to reconnect with the world, to see the world from another person's point of view, is essential now as ever. My colleague Wayne Carlin, Vietnam War veteran, novelist, has spent the better part of his life trying to get people to understand how important it is to connect with other perspectives through writing, through literature. And Phil's picking up that torch for his generation and carrying it forward. And we need to do that because, as we mentioned earlier, what's the alternative? So it's about novels and poems that speak to our obsession with hatred and war and the damage that we do to ourselves and to others and to our bodies and to our souls and the aftermath of violence, cycles of violence, and how to recover from trauma. We can't seem to break these cycles of violence. And we need to be able to reconnect with the world, and it's through literature that we can do that. And I've been working with my students on this, and I think it's very important that students understand literature is not something just to be tested on for the multiple choice test. It's something to be experienced. Sand Opera is essentially a love poem, one that embraces each of us and all our humanity, and it encourages us to see the world beyond our day-to-day reality. It encourages us to go back home to seeing the world through the eyes of a child's primal wonder, past the fear and the brutality toward a greater union with each other. Phil is in the long line of writers such as Wayne Carlin, who express their faith in our capacity for empathy, feeling for another person, and for feeling for another person's suffering, for learning from the mistakes of the past, and for leaving the world a better place than how we found it. Ladies and gentlemen, Phil Metris.
Thanks so much to Wayne for inviting me, and I had a wonderful dinner with Neil and Wayne and Rachel. Thanks Neil for having me here. Did I say Wayne? Wow. Did I say Wayne? Sorry. Okay. Thanks to Neil for inviting me. And so I thought I would just begin with talking a little bit, just for a moment, about sort of what draws me to poetry and why I love teaching it and why I hope that you find something in it for yourself. And it begins in an airport, in O'Hare Airport in Chicago, the busiest airport in the country, maybe in the world. Maybe. So I'm sitting there minding my own business, waiting for a flight home to Cleveland, swirls of people passing by me, and suddenly a man about 30 years old sits right across me and starts staring at me, and I immediately start to get creeped out by this, of course. And I looked at him, and I smiled or something, I don't know, I'm trying to allay the tension. And he said, "Did you teach at John Carroll?" And I said, "Yeah, I still do. I teach." And he said, "I think I took American literature with you." I said, yeah, you look familiar. He was 10 years older and a bit thicker, but nonetheless, the same face I recall, a quiet student. He said, "I still remember the poem." And I said, "What poem?" He said, "The one we all had to memorize a poem." And he stood up in the middle of the airport and began to recite the poem. Wow. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening, which is a familiar old, poem. But whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And I thought it was just so beautiful, and I was absolutely touched that 10 years after this class, he was still carrying this poem around with him in his mind and in his heart. It meant something to him. And I asked him, "So what are you up to?" And he said, "I'm an actuary." I said, "What's an actuary?" And he said, I predict the future. I'm a mathematician, a statistician. I try to figure out what's going to happen." And, it's sort of, I was like, all right. But all he wanted to do was sort of talk about this experience he had in my class. And so each of us are absolutely connected to language and to bits of language, whether it's prayers that our parents or grandparents taught us, or something that we memorized, or the Pledge of Allegiance, or a poem that you carry around with you, or song lyrics. That's probably the most popular way that we connect with language in a sort of personal way. What I want you to think about and invite you to think about is the ways in which language sustains us and carries us as we carry it along with ourselves. And I hope that if you haven't found that text or that thing that does that for you, to look for it until you find it. And it may be not just one text. It might not be one poem, but it might be many poems. And it might be many stories that you can paraphrase, if not memorize. And that's part of the reason why I love this thing called poetry, is that it sustains us and it opens us to not only our lives, the ways in which it can help us understand, for example, that poem that I just read, "Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening." It's about someone who is suddenly, in the midst of some solitudinous moment, even though his life is very busy, like all of our lives are very busy and packed, but he wants to go someplace where he won't be seen, just to be alone and to see the woods fill up with the snow and to be there. And maybe he wants to just run away from his life, like so many of us probably do half the time, want to run away from his life. But somehow this moment allows him to, for whatever reason, maybe the horse itself, who thinks it's really strange that he's stopped in the woods, there's nothing here. Maybe we should go back. Your survival instinct isn't kicking in. Something in him, even though the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, is ready to sort of go back into his life. And I think that what is so beautiful about what poetry can do is it can help us anchor ourselves in ourselves at the same time, as Neil so powerfully said, is the way in which it can open us to the experiences of people who are not ourselves. Right? Like, you don't know who I am, and I don't know who you are, right? In the cap, right? The red cap, right? You have your life, which is all yours, and it's secret to you in some sense. And I have no idea what I'm going to say, like I'm going to reach you at all. But that's my job, is to figure out, like, what can I say that might open the lock, that helps you start thinking about your own life and who we are in relationship to everybody else, and how we might be connected in ways that we don't yet see. So that's just a little, I don't know what you call it, a little homily. I'll step off my soapbox. And I did ask Neil if there were a couple volunteers to do a poem together. Are they somewhere here? Or can we get 3 volunteers to read a poem with me? This is called Cell Phone. It's a simultaneous 4 voices, cell phone.
The number
You are wanted.
Hey, how are you?
You are not alone.
Hang up and dial the operator.
You are wanted.
Please hang up and try again.
You are not alone.
The following codes are for the deaf community.
Someone needs to answer me now. Someone needs me to answer
The number
now.
you have reached is
Someone needs me alone, and no one else
Please
to
hang up and
answer
try
now.
again.
I wait for you. For you alone.
She must move on with her
I
life.
text. I sell. I am
The number
wanted.
you have reached has been
I have to take
disconnected.
this call.
If you need help,
I have to
hang
take
up
this
and dial
call.
the operator. Please
You are
hang up and
wanted.
try again.
You are not
I'm not
alone.
very
The following codes are for the
You are
deaf
wanted.
community.
But she must move on.
Not alone.
She's very older.
Someone needs to answer me now.
The number you have reached has been disconnected. Please hang up and try again.
No one else to answer now. I am wanted. I have to take this call. Thanks, guys. You did great. That poem didn't finish for me until the Guantanamo voice came in. At first it was just like a satire of our distraction of cell phones, but somewhere I found this interview that a prisoner in the Guantanamo Bay prison gave to a New York Times reporter, in which he said, "Please pass this message to my wife. Tell her to move on with her life. I know I'm never leaving this. Tell her that I love her, but it's time to move on. She's getting old, and it's time to move on." That just blew me away. And you can't hear it, right? Because you hear all of these other things. All of the noise of our own lives, the noise of our pop culture, the noise of Bieber. Apparently he's been involved in something recently. What is that distracting us from? Right? What is that distracting us from? I think literature is so powerful because it's such a focused attempt to move us into the lives of others. It's that very simple thing that we learn when we're children, that these stories that we hear are not just about other people, but they're about us imagining ourselves as other people, engaging in their very different lives, and having the same struggles that we have. And through our walking with them imaginatively, we can see their humanity, and they can show us our humanity back to us. So there's this wonderful theorist named John Paul Lederach, who's been involved in a lot of peace building. He has a book called The Moral Imagination. And the first element, he says that he's basically worked around the world in situations of conflict, trying to get people together who basically want to kill each other, right? Trying to get people to a single table to talk and to figure out what's at stake for each side, or multiples of sides. And he says the first thing he realized is all of his science background, all his political science background, all of his sociological background was really important to him. But what really made peace happen between these people was something like an art. And he calls it the moral imagination, that people who are ready and willing to to resolve conflict tend to have certain capabilities that go beyond professional capabilities for conflict resolution or conflict management, mediation. And the first is the ability to empathize with the other, to imagine yourself in a web of relationships which includes even your enemies. To imagine yourself in a web of relationships which includes even your enemies, which is such a powerful thing to say. He's not saying like, they don't have to be your enemy anymore, but you have to see yourself as part of a web of relationships which includes them. And webs are kind of interesting, right? Because, you know, if someone tears off a bunch of web, you know, you could be in trouble if you're the spider, right? So having that whole list of links of connection is important to sustain and to imagine. So this book, I'm going to read some poems, I guess, from Sand Opera, is basically a kind of series of poems meditating on different subject points of view and delivering different voices from the sort of post-9/11 era, one of which is more or less my own. They're sort of autobiographical fictions in the sense that I grew up proudly Lebanese American, Arab American, but I know that there are people who are more recent immigrants to this country. My dad's second generation, so I'm third generation. There are people who have experienced far more difficulties post 9/11 who are Arab American. By the way, also Christian, but that's probably confusing to some of you how you could be Arab and Christian, but that's part of the interesting diversity and complexity of the Middle East. So I know that there are people who suffered a lot more than I did, but it became a way for me to sort of talk about this experience. So for those of you who are young enough not really to remember 9/11, suffice to say it was a catalyzing, powerful, traumatizing moment for so many of us, basically for the whole country and in some sense for the world. What happened afterwards, I think in retrospect we could say a certain kind of madness descended upon us. We're still living with that madness. I mean, in some sense, the Patriot Act, which continues to be renewed, is a set of laws which attack some of the very foundations of what's great about America, and that's something that we still haven't quite worked out. So although for some of you it's not really even a thing, 9/11, we're still living very much in this moment. So here's some poems. The first kind of meditates on the actual attacks of 9/11. I had a friend who was part of the sort of rescue team who went to the towers as they were smoldering, and another college friend whose father died in them. I'm sort of thinking about this sort of big trauma. This is a poem about that, I guess, in a way. It's from a sequence called Homefront. You look at me, looking at you. How close the words creation and cremation. How in Hebrew Adam is kin to dust. How the stars swam in Abraham's eyes, his profligate future. Uncountable windows of light flashing open-eyed. The towers burn down into themselves, just like a cigarette, the poet laureate wanted to say, and did on air, knowing that distance makes metaphors terrifying, but the world less so, dividing the night from night. How to describe the twisted angles and planes? Picasso, a picture is a sum of destructions. The wind draws dust into us. Thus, he who held Klieg lights at ground zero carries the towers in lung roots. We are windows, half open, half reflecting, trying to impersonate someone who can breathe. The second poem is sort of about this vexatious experience of identifying in some sense with the Middle East as a person. I feel an attachment and connection to it. And it was such a horrible experience to see that the attackers were from the Middle East. A great sense of shame, I think, descended on me. and recognition and sorrow about what happened at that moment. It's also just about how we dehumanize each other so easily. There's this quotation in this version of the poem about journalism and how certain deaths are sort of made more important than other deaths. So it's a kind of meditation on that. As if somehow I were responsible. Patriotism is a feeling, the student wrote, that is rotted deep inside every one of us. And it's hard to let something such as your country go to shame. The photos of hijackers look like a Warhol of my family album. The women oddly absent, portraits bleared in displaced layers of ink. Who fed you? Who changed you? Who memorized your hands? Who took you in? The ex-editor of Life lays down the old rule of thumb in journalism. 1 person dead in your paper's hometown equals 5 dead the next town over, equals 50 dead the next state, or 5,000 dead in China. The homeland is late blue and tastes of metal, like blood in the mouth. My cousins, my demons, my plotting and foiled selves, what have you done? What have we done with us? Around that time, there was a unfortunate incident where a guy tried to light a shoe on a plane. The infamous shoe bomber from 2002, I think, 2003. He failed, but as a consequence, if you ever take a flight, you have to take off your shoes. So you can thank that jerk for that. In any case, this poem is sort of about flying while Arab. I had this incident where I was given the stink eye on the flight the whole way. Someone was afraid because I was brown or something. I don't know. But at the time, I was really angry and offended that this person wouldn't stop looking at me the whole flight. It was a transatlantic flight, so she was staring a long time. And I think, in some sense, that the poem sort of came out of that sense of being othered by this person, and also not knowing what to say to it. So, on the flight overseas, the rows dotted with isolados, each an island of eyes. I was looking like. What outside is a cross, inside is a window. A white woman across the aisle eyed me the entire flight. Her gaze widened and neck craned as her eyes, slowly removed her eyes, my shoes. What could I say? Sometimes I'm afraid I'm carrying a bomb. Then I'm a sleeper and don't know when I'll awaken. I should have said, identity isn't an end. It's a portal, a deportation from the country of mirrors, an inflection within a question, punctuation in the sentence of birth. I said nothing. Later, in a Quaker meeting, I sat among scattered chairs. On the shores of breathing, all eyes shut, I waited. Silence our rudder, silence our harbor. I want to just explain one of the lines in it because I just love it so much. I lived in Russia for a year after college, and I translated some Russian poets. One of the guy's name is Ivan Zhdanov, and he had this line that I just love so much I had to put it in my poem. What outside is a cross, inside is a window. What outside is a cross, inside is a window. It's just a powerful little image that is suggestive of what seems like something that causes us suffering or something that weighs us down may be a way that we can see into the world outside. Not to overly parse the own poem, but I love that image so much. I just want to make sure you got just how amazing that is. And I think in some sense it's part of the ethos, it's part of the spirit of the book, that sometimes these things that actually cause us suffering can be ways that we can see the world more clearly, not to see it as alien from us, but that, that we can somehow realize that, in a sense, everyone actually has suffering. Everyone is bearing some kind of something. And that if we can sort of anchor ourselves in that kind of moment of empathy, that the world might be a little bit better place, you know? I remember I had a student, there's one more thing about that. I had a student who said, like, you know, doing a creative writing class, she said at the end of the class she wrote some evaluations. And by the way, you should do this for your teachers. Like, really give them good not like lie, but really focus, like, what did you actually learn in this class? This person said, after a creative writing class, it's just like, she said, I learned to have more patience with other people and to not just like react immediately out of my sense of my own emotion, that everybody is dealing with something and I just don't know what it is. You know, it happened that class, people were writing some really personal stuff, so that they realized, you know, like, I'm judging you, no, you're a human being, you know, you're a human being with this story that you just don't know. You had a comment or a question, yeah. Yeah. So the Quakers, for those of you who don't know, they're a religious group, Christian more or less, depending on your Quakers. And they have this very beautiful way of meeting together they actually call it a meeting. They don't call it like service or mass or whatever, they call it meeting. What they do is they get in a room with chairs facing each other and just sit there and wait for the Spirit to move them. And they could be silent for 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minutes. So at some point, someone just stands up and they say what the Spirit is saying through them. And so at the time, we were living actually the Quakers owned the house. And so at the bottom floor, there was this space where the chairs were. So I occasionally would go down there. Sometimes I would sit with them. I'm not Quaker myself, but I think at the end of this poem, I'm struggling with two kinds of silence. The kinds of silence that can help us center ourselves and anchor ourselves in the sense of listening to the God that's in us, maybe, listening to the Spirit move through us. And the other kind of silence, which is silencing, you know, which is when someone imposes their reality or their narrative on you and makes it impossible for you to sort of to be, you know. So silence our rudder. Like the Quakers really believe that, like, if you're quiet, something's going to happen to you, and that's some spirit's going to move you. But we also know that silence can be dangerous for all the reasons, you know, when we don't speak up when we see wrong. So yeah, I get those two kinds of silence. I would also say, like, is anybody taking creative writing in here? Just one?
Taking or have?
Taking.
Oh.
Taking, have taken? Anybody writing? Anybody keep a journal? Yeah. I mean, we have to be quiet in order to hear whatever it is we need to get out. So that's like something that, like, put away your phones, quiet yourself, and something's going to start happening. It's the most beautiful thing. I can't describe it. Yeah, but silence our rudder, silence our harbor. Want to hear some more poems? Okay. So I just want to let you know that one of my daughters came with me. We drove today from Cleveland. It took us like a bazillion hours. So can you give her a hand for going the whole way? Her name is Layla. She's a great kid. She says all sorts of awesome things. Like the other morning I said she's homeschooled, and so she can go to school whenever we want her to go to school. This is part of her education tonight. I said, sweetie, it's 8:41. Aren't you hungry? She was in bed, just like still in bed, and usually she's up by about 7. She was just reading. Aren't you hungry? She's like, I'm feeling hungry, but I'm feeling booky. Yeah. So I thought that was awesome. I thought you needed to know that. In the middle of this book are a series of poems sort of about my eldest daughter. Maybe I'll read one of those. Since she's not here, we can sort of honor her too. And I think to me it's the most, in some sense, the most important and certainly the most personal part of the book is meditating on what it means to bring children into a world that we know is so strife-ridden and so worrisome as parents. And in some way, I think that she provided me a way of feeling both my concern for how much she was absorbing from the radio and things like that, and also a certain sense of confidence about the person she was and the way that she was listening to herself, which is something that rhymes with what I just mentioned about silence. So there's a new theory that you shouldn't praise children too much because it knocks them off of their own sense about what gives them pleasure, actually. Then they start to just try to please you by doing things that are for you rather than enjoying what it is that they are doing. My parents were notorious, complimenters. So to this day, I love getting compliments. It's terrible. It's a debility, actually, as opposed to just feeling like, oh, I want this, or I like this. This makes me feel whole. This makes me feel good. The new theory, not to praise too much, lest the child lose her inner sense of what pleasures the listening tuned inward. In silence before sleep, looking up to her ceiling, 4 years in her mind, she says, someone is telling the story of our life. I see her great-grandmother in her brown eyes, in her royal of curls. I don't know who it is. In the woods of her wander, she says, they will be telling it our whole life. She actually said that. And it's such a powerful recognition of the way in which we are always telling our own story to ourselves, and also feel that somehow it's not us, right? That there's something else going on. And some of that's sinister, actually, like that we're constantly being narrated into stories that we don't want to accept. That's not my story, but it's imposed on us. So she asks, is that man crying or singing? How should I answer? War takes him in its fingers, raises his body, a punctured bone flute to its lips, and breathes the living dust to dust alone. This is the air we scull, air of ancestors and ash pits. Just 5, the child's baptized into this unhappiness. She corrects the voices she hears butcher the name of the country she's never seen. It's Iraq, not Iraq. I guess it was one of my complaints, which she inherited. It's not Iraq. It's not Arab. They're not Arabs. They're Arabs. Arabs. Okay, I'm going to read this last from this little sequence. And should we call it after this one, or a couple more? Okay. What does it mean, I say? She says, it means to be quiet, just by yourself. She says, there's a treasure chest inside. You get to dig it out. Somehow it's spring. Says, will it always rain? In some countries, I say, they're praying for rain. She says, why do birds sing? In the dream, my notebook dipped in water, all the writing lost. Says, read the story again. But which one? That which diverts the mind is poetry. Says, you know those planes that hit those buildings? Asks, why do birds sing? When the storm ends, she stops, holds her hands together, closes her eyes. What are you doing? I ask. I'm praying for the dead worms. Says, listen. Now I know that in Neil's class you read some of the arias. Should I read one or two of those pieces? I see that. All right, let's do that. Do you want to help me with it? Sure. Okay, come on. Sure. All right. Putting Professor Dwyer to work. Yeah, okay. So. So, for those of you who don't recall or have never heard of, there was a prison scandal during the Iraq War in 2003, 2004, where it was discovered that U.S. military police were abusing and torturing Iraqi detainees. There's a whole story behind that. I don't want to get into the entire story, but just to say that it was a shame and a scandal, and it became, in some sense, a blight on that war and a blight on our name. And it revealed again the nastiness and inhumanity of war, despite whatever good intentions that people go into it, that the dark side of human beings tends to emerge. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to do in this sequence of poems was deliver both the voices of U.S. service personnel and the Iraqis themselves, and I found a number of texts which I sort of generated the poem from. This is one of the testimonies delivered in two voices. So, 1, 2, 3. In the name of God, I swear to God, everything I witnessed, everything I am talking about, I am not saying this to gain any material thing, and I was not pressured to do so by any forces. I will not talk about what happened when I was in jail before, because they did not ask me, but it was very bad. They stripped me of my clothes, even my underwear. They gave me women's underwear that was rose-colored with flowers in it, and they put the bag over my face. One of them whispered in my ear, "Today I'm going to... Thy name shall be," and he said this in Arabic. Whoever was with me experienced the same thing, cuffed my hands with irons behind my back to the metal of the window to the point that my feet were on the ground and I was hanging there for about 5 hours just because I asked about the time, because I wanted to pray. Took all my clothes and took the underwear and he put it over my head. After he released me, I don't know if they took a picture of me because they beat me so bad. I lost. In the name, I swear, everything I witnessed, everything I am not saying, not talk about what happened. They did not ask me. They gave me my ear. Thy name shall be hanging there over my head. Thank him for that. Thank you, Nick. Charles Greener, one of the perpetrators of the abuse, a very unfortunate fellow. The Christian in me knows it's wrong, but the corrections officer in me can't help but love making a grown man piss himself. The Blues of Ken Davis. And I remember calling home that night and saying, I can't take this anymore. If this is what we're going to do, if this is what we become, then I'm done. They say talk to a chaplain. They say it's all your perception. And every night it's amazing because you're lying there. No matter how much music you play, no matter how loud you turn it up, you still can hear the classified. All right, maybe one more poem. It's got to be a good one. Okay, this is about kids too. So I live in a almost entirely Jewish Orthodox neighborhood. It's a really amazing experience. So this is just outside of Cleveland. I'm not Orthodox, so I'm an outsider. Sometimes there's these amazing, wonderful relationships that can happen, but there's also this feeling of really being an outsider. And some of the lessons that we give our children are very painful and separating. And yet sometimes these same children can absorb these other truths about our connectedness. So this sort of gets into that. My daughter Adele is referenced in the poem. Our next door neighbor, weirdly, her name is Adina, Adele. They both have brown curly hair. Arabs and Jews all together. It's very, very interesting and strange. This was about an unfortunate incident that became telling and fortunate in its own way. It's called The Daily Contortions. He's rushing down the block, away from shul, dressed in black hat, black coat and pants, even black socks, peeking from lemon yellow Crocs. Yom Kippur, my daughter's 10-year-old friend Tehila informs us. You can't wear leather, you don't eat, you get the chance to become an angel. The kids are gathered, neighbors around Aviva's swing, whose arc's so wide you wonder if you're flying. The seat chains ascend to a limb so high it's heaven, whatever our religion. We take turns giving underdogs, which means helping others to wing, as Layla says, still lacking letters. Who can use the swing? What symbols printed on boxes indicate something is forbidden or not? These are the daily signs we study and are flummoxed by. In the meantime, Aviva, our neighbor, the splitting image of my daughter, refuses her pretzels. I don't give non-Jews pretzels, she explains, but I can give them to my dog. But Adele's almost Jewish, Rahel insists. Aren't you, Adele? Who among us does not want pretzels, pretziola, the little rewards monks would grant to children reciting Bible verses, which, read wrongly, one day would darken into Kristallnacht? The little arms of Brachia folded in prayer, a crucifixion treat to savor and swallow. Here the daily contortions continue. Who can do what, and who cannot, and by what law is it possible, and to sate which God hungry for our obedience? I want to shake this little angel, the flaming sword of her words expelling my daughter from the garden of her yard. The peace process is a matter of a third girl, Rahel, breaking her pretzel, handing the savory splinter to Adele. Thanks.
Fantastic. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Don't be shy.
All right.
I know it's so nerve-wracking, isn't it, to ask questions in public? Your heart starts to race, and it's totally natural.
This might be a very personal question.
Sure.
So I apologize in advance for that, but at Abu Ghraib,
Yeah.
at that prison,
Yeah.
was there any sort of justification that any of the soldiers had for committing the acts? Did they say that these people had taken their family members or had done acts to them that made it seem like they deserved what they were getting?
That's a brilliant question, right? Of course, there's always a reason that people can give to do things, and so of course, I mean, if you want a full analysis of the situation, the U.S. service personnel were under duress. There were mortars coming on, so they were under a stressful situation. Then from the side, they were encouraged by not their commanding officers, but military intelligence and the CIA to engage in softening up operations on these terrorists, even though no one was convicted of terrorism. And almost all of the people in the prison were either bystanders or common criminals or whatever. So they had nothing involved with terrorism. But yeah, so there was an encouragement going on, and it actually violated the core principles of the professionalism of the Army. It violated what's called the chain of command. So some people like to say, well, Charles Grainer, these are just bad apples. But it was a structural failure for which a lot of people who are fairly high up in our government are responsible. There was a systematic attempt to use certain methods to extract information. But you're right, so those individual soldiers were placed in a really weird position, right? Because they wanted to, A, protect themselves, serve their country and follow their orders. They're getting different orders from different places. Some of their people are encouraging them to do it. Some of their fellow service personnel are like, actually, the way we know it is there was a hero in the story in the sense that Joe Darby, a guy who was literally, comrades, buddies with Charles Grainer, didn't know what was happening. He wasn't serving the night shift or whatever. He saw the pictures because Grainer gave him a CD of photos, I don't know, accidentally gave him the night photos, and he was just astonished, and he gave them to the person involved in looking at investigations for misconduct. So that's how we know about it. Is somebody said, this is wrong. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. Well, it's complicated. That was a long answer, but did it answer your question?
No, sort of.
Google it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, by the way.
Thanks.
This is kind of like going on with what John just said, and you read both the poems. The blues of Carl Granger said, the Christian in me knows it's wrong, but the correction officer in me can't help but love making a grown man diss himself. Excuse me for saying that.
That's what he said.
That's what he
Just
said.
a quote.
Right. And then he said, as if someone I was responsible, and I sit down, said one person getting your papers hometown is equals 5 debt in the next town, and then 50, and it goes to the state, and it goes to the next country.
Right.
So in two different poems, you kind of brought out the fact that I'm a Christian. I don't believe in hurting anyone. I don't believe in this torture. But you might have killed someone in my hometown,
Right.
and doggone if I don't care. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah. Isn't that part of the essential tension between one's Christian faith and its universalizing impulse to say that every one of us is formed in the shape of God? That we're in God's image. I mean, that's what the Bible says. If every human being is actually formed in God's image, does that mean that we can kill the image of God? So I think within Christianity, there's a radical call to seeing all people, regardless of nation, as part of the human and therefore divine connected people. Yeah, so it's tough. But many people in the armed forces are also deeply and devoutly Christian. So that there's this kind of question about how we read Christianity. Is it a universalizing impulse? How do we read it relative to this idea of protecting our own, right? Which is another very deeply strong and primal impulse we have. So, and I don't have the answers for that. You got to figure that out. Everyone has to answer that question for themselves. But I would invite Christians to think about, if we really believe that, what is it that we're doing?
It's kind of like the cross in the window.
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned that you spent time in Russia.
Yeah.
As both the Polish and the third generation American immigrant, how do you feel? Do you find any parallels between the former Soviet Union and Iraq? As both one of the two most despised countries.
Yeah, well, I think, I was a bit rebellious in the sense that when I heard Ronald Reagan say that the Soviet Union or Russia was the evil empire, I instantly thought, well, how can an entire people be evil? I want to figure out what it is about these people. I want to figure out what their humanity is. So that actually drew me to go there and live there.
Did you figure it out?
Well, I think, did I figure it out? In some ways, I'm still answering that question. I would say that some of my naivete was dispelled in the sense that systems systems encourage sometimes the worst in people to come out. And certainly in the Soviet Union, that happened. But our own system sometimes encourages the worst in people to come out. I want to say two more things, soapboxy things. One is that our fundamentalism is capitalism. Until we understand that we need to interrogate the basic premises of what capitalism is, until we understand that our capitalism is a kind of national faith. And it's a dangerous faith because we have not really explored its full implications for exploiting people. And the other thing I would just say is that I wish upon each of you to get out of whatever bubble that you find yourself in, to go to another state, to go ideally to another country. Because one of the things Neil and Wayne and I were talking about in the car ride over is that helps people relinquish their hatred sometimes of other people is to simply get out of the situation in which they find themselves, to recognize that they are in a temporary, geographically located kind of illness, right? That if they can sort of be outside of it, they can realize, oh, I don't have to feel this way about myself and about that guy, that person. This is a kind of construct which is very located in a certain kind of space. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, please, if you have the chance, or create the chance for yourself to get out of whatever bubble that you find yourself in, to challenge yourself, to get to know people who are unlike you, and make friends with people that you would have never imagined making friends with. And that happens when you sort of move outside of your known places and spaces. So, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you.